Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Gary, for building this talk up earlier on. I noticed we're running late now, so I'll make it quick. If you're anything like me, it's getting a bit warm and my arse cheeks were getting a bit numb, so, you know, I won't be offended if you need to stretch at this point. But like my colleague Steve Fowkes, I'm also going to talk about money, so there's a slight sense that I might keep you all involved. I'm going to talk mainly about the current grant scheme and what's coming next, and I'm going to pause in between just to say hail and farewell to a couple of our European projects. I think it's useful just to kind of cover where we are, because that does set the context. As it's been made clear, these European grants go in 7-year cycles. Never worked out why it's 7 years, but it is. We're coming to the end of one of those 7-year cycles, and there's opportunities ahead for us all. I don't expect you to read or take notes about this slide. The basic message is that under the current grant scheme, English Woodland Grant Scheme, if we had your application in by the end of August, all things being equal, we will attempt to have that process by Christmas. We are, I'm told, 99.9% sure that there will be some grants next year in the so-called transitional year. The two grants that we don't think will be available next year are woodland creation grants, so for new planting. So if you didn't get an application in by the end of August for a woodland creation scheme, you've missed the boat for a couple of years, I'm afraid, from the Forestry Commission. Worth pointing out that the Woodland Trust is offering significant subsidies. Well, they'll provide you free trees and shelters. Initially, that was for small plantations, but now they're considering that for even bigger ones. So they may be worth talking to in the interim. The other thing that won't be available next year is the management grant for recreation access. But we think all the other grants will be available in some form next year under the old rules. And as the new scheme comes on, you'll get a sense of how advantageous the new rules are. So you'll either take advantage of the old rules or the new rules as you see fit. Who was it who mentioned the wood fuel grant? There is some money unspent in that for infrastructure particularly. So, the whole thing doesn't come to a grinding halt next year. That slide's just to remind me, under the new rules, all our grants will require a management plan, but a lot of you are already moving towards having management plans anyway, so that shouldn't be a huge shock. And we'll pay current rates £1,000 minimum to produce that plan. So that's the existing scheme, been tremendously successful. We've spent more money in this part of the world than we have in any other part of the world in getting grants. A lot of that's gone out to woodland owners and contractors. That's fantastic. That underpins the sector to some extent. And in this part of the world, we've been very lucky to have these two European projects. We've got Anne Mason from the Wild Venison Project and David Hooton from the Deer Initiative in here, and Sid Cooper from Woodfuel East. Both those projects, they were only available in this part of the world. They brought in millions of pounds of funding. We've worked really closely with the sector to deliver those. So in both cases, there's been steering groups that have had real people in them. Mike chairs the Woodfuel project, for example. They have made all their recommendations. That really brought in the best technical advice that we could hope. I think they've been a fantastic success. If you look at Woodfuel East, it's brought over 100,000 cubic metres per annum additional onto the market in the 6 counties, and brought almost 10,000 hectares of undermanaged woodland into management. So that's fantastic. If you haven't taken advantage of either of those two projects, sorry, it's now too late. But I think I've got some hope for you in the next project. Edwin van Eck, who ran the Woodfuel project, has now left to another job in the civil service. Good for him. And Sid, whereas Sid has taken over the role of the project manager to see it close. So I'm really happy that Sid's managed to to do that. Sid, incidentally, will stay in then in the Forestry Commission because he goes back to a sort of former role of woodland officer. So it's an excellent thing where we keep Sid in the patch. Right, so the thing I really want to concentrate on is the next rural development round of funding and how that can benefit you as woodland owners and woodland managers in the next 7 years. Well, the next 6 years, because it will start in 2015. It gets a bit complicated, but stick with me. There are effectively going to be 4 ways that you can access money from the next programme. 2 of those I'll mention and then not talk about them anymore. It's possible that local enterprise partnerships will have some of the rural development funding. And we think particularly for large-scale secondary processing, for example, there may be funding coming into the sector. But I sense for the majority of you in this room, local enterprise partnerships aren't somebody that you need to engage with to get money in the next round. Equally, there will be money designated to the so-called leader projects. If you haven't come across leader before, I won't bore you with that. The acronym is lost in time. It's French. I forget what it means. But essentially, these are local groups who are able to disperse the money. And we've had one in Breckland and the Waveney Valley. The aspiration is that everywhere will have a leader project next time round. And we have had 1 or 2 projects, wood fuel projects in the east of England that have gone through the leader process. So that's not impossible next round. However, most of you will engage, I think, through 2 schemes next time round. The first one is the new the new environmental management scheme. That won't necessarily be its final title. NELMS is the shorthand they're calling it. And that will integrate English Woodland Grant Scheme with the Natural England's Environmental Stewardship Scheme into one scheme. And broadly the proposals are, but there are some important nuances, but broadly the sorts of things that you've been familiar with under EWGS will be available under NELMS. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. The other area of funding is in effect the equivalent to the wood fuel east and wild venison projects, which will be funded through a farming and forestry productivity scheme. And I'll say a bit more about that also in a minute. Now, we're at a really important point, so it's great that Gary gave me the opportunity to talk about this, because the consultation on the Common Agricultural Policy and the Rural Development Scheme is open now, closes on the 28th of November, I think, so we've got effectively 2 weeks. And I think they've had over 800 responses so far, but I would urge every single person in this room, both as an individual and as an organisation, to respond to that consultation. And I would say there are at least 3 things you should say if you say nothing else. Firstly, you should comment on the modulation from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. Now, some of you will be really ingrained in all of this and you'll understand what I'm talking about. Others won't have a clue. Essentially, Pillar 1 funding is the stuff that pays the single farm payment to farmers. Pillar 2 pays for the agri-environment scheme. There are a number of proposals in the consultation for levels of funding from Pillar 1 being so-called modulated into Pillar 2. My understanding, I'm no expert in this, my understanding, if that modulation doesn't happen at anything lower than 15%, I mean, there are proposals for 9% modulation, 15%, and probably one other as well. If it's modulated at 9%, basically the money that has already been spent under the current programme soaks up all the entire budget. So it's not modulated at 15%, there'll be no money for forestry grant schemes. So that's the first thing I would say to you to comment on. Secondly, if you've liked things about the existing schemes, say that you like them to ensure that they're in the new programme, whether that's about primarily about EWGS schemes. If you like certain interventions or they've been useful to you, say that, because they might not appear in the next round. And the third thing is, if you're up for it, is to support the proposals around forest productivity that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So if there's one thing to take away, it's respond to this deeply dull consultation, which is, you know, you can Google it, no doubt, or you just go through the DEFRA website. But if there's one thing to take away from this, do that, please. Others might like to comment in a minute about whether I got the points right or not. Okay, so our aspiration through this farming and forestry productivity scheme is to get the forestry sector access to these grants, the sorts of grants that have been available through Wood Fuel East and the Wild Venison Project, to increase the support to the supply chain. Now, the basic proposal is that this farming and forestry productivity scheme will be a simple scheme available online, open to all comers. There'll be some windows of application and you apply with the scheme rules. Our experience of similar DEFRA schemes, and these are run by the RDT, the Rural Delivery Teams in DEFRA, our experience of the equivalent ones so far is forestry does not get a look into these schemes because the agricultural sector is much better, it's geared up, it tends to be bigger organisations who are employing agents, etc., to get into this funding. You can, as an individual, apply for these grants under the new system, and you fall into the pot with everybody else. And that's nothing about what I'm going to say now stops you doing that. However, what we've tried to put together is a package of proposals that will help woodland owners and woodland agents, woodland businesses, to collaborate together to get better access to these funds. So how will that work? Effectively, we see it working within two packages, one based around timber and one based around venison. The timber one has got a working title of Woodland Enterprise, but it's basically timber and wood fuel. And the venison one I'll go on to talk about briefly in a minute. Through the Farming and Forestry Productivity Scheme, we think these are the sorts of interventions that will be eligible under the new scheme. If you agree that these are the sorts of interventions that you like, then say so in the consultation. I think most eyes will be drawn down to the bottom, looking at the capital equipment, whether that's fording trailers or a mobile saw bench or wood chip stores, that sort of thing. But I think some of the other interventions could be really powerful in terms of support to the sector. And so we were talking earlier about support for skills, learning and development, for example. So some of that should be fundable under the new programme. In terms of deer and wild venison, we all know why we're having to manage the deer. These are the sorts of support that we could see through that. So we've done a lot of work with the Deer Initiative and the Wild Venison Project on small-scale larders to improve the holding capacity and the quality of the meat and so on. And again, there's training and wider support in those packages. So there's some good stuff to play for, which we can't fund through EWGS NELMS. Whoops. How would it work? Well, essentially, you'd need a group of people willing to work together in a geography, a landscape. Could be Suffolk and Norfolk, it could be the 6 counties, it could be smaller. But a sense of people willing to work together in collaboration. They would essentially put together a plan, which they put to DEFRA, that requires some very un-British things about working together and actually putting your hand in your pocket to give some time as well initially. Out of that, if DEFRA think that that's something they want to invest in, they would then pay for a facilitation post, a project officer, somebody who would then work with individual landowners and businesses to get you best bang for bucks in terms of your application to DEFRA. It's no guarantee, but once DEFRA see that that's part of this umbrella plan, then hopefully we'll get some sort of fast streaming. This is all to play for. None of this is decided yet. So if you like this sort of thing, then respond to the consultation. You would then have, that group would then give some local steering and make recommendations to DEFRA and the project officer. Essentially, that project officer helps you understand what DEFRA want in terms of the application, goes through different alternatives, very much like Anne and Graham did on the deer project and Sid and Phil did on Wood Fuel East, to help the applicant understand how this thing works, this whole beast, and hopefully you get a better bang for your buck then in terms of getting some of this funding. Unlike Wood Fuel East, that doesn't ring fence any of the money. You're still applying into the pot, but at least you've got a better handle for it. Now, one of the things to make this work will need an organisation willing to host that facilitator, project officer post. But I'm encouraged to have some discussions with a number of organisations who are considering that. The DEAR initiative, for example, might be willing to host the DEAR post conversations in some of the membership organisations willing to host that post. And if you get that right, you can tie up the sort of interventions that you can get through the Farming and Forestry Productivity Scheme with the forestry, EWGS, NELMS type interventions into wider packages. So then we could fast stream some of those that we get through NELMS, for example. And like that, you get support right through the entire supply chain, from stump through to retail almost. So it's quite exciting in as much as there's funding to play for in this next round. It needs us to get our heads around this collaboration thing if we want to really make this tick. As I said, there's nothing stopping individual businesses applying for these funds independently, but I think you'd get less mileage out of it if you went that way. How would it work? So there'd be some sort of periodic calls, maybe every 6 months, whatever. The bids would be appraised. If successful, you get up to 6 years' worth of funding. That would be the project officer post, could be 100% funded, is our understanding, so that's quite attractive. Typically, we see these to be the sorts of scales of the interventions. So, a £5 million project around wood fuel, or a £500,000 project around venison. They could be higher or lower, but that's the sorts of interventions we typically envisage through this. So, again, in terms of our sector, these are not insignificant sums. So, that's a quick run through in 15 minutes. It's a complicated thing. We are intending to run a number of workshops, seminars, one-to-ones next year to get this part of the world ready, if they want to play this game in terms of the productivity stuff, ready to make applications in 2014. Thank you.